Thanks for staying with News at Prime tonight. The Economic Community of West African States is preparing to meet later this week to discuss a suspended member, Burkina Faso. It comes after a military coup in the country. Opposition leaders have highlighted the country's need for good governance.
Until recently, there's been no information on the whereabouts or condition of Burkina Faso's ousted president. But on Monday, Roch Kabore had visitors, representatives from the West African bloc, ECOWAS. The head of the delegation, former Ghanaian Foreign Minister Shirley Ayokor-Botchre, said Kabore has access to doctors and is allowed visits from his family.
On the surface, I mean, we've had a good conversation with him, and he's in good health, and he was able to have a good conversation with us, and we will send that back to the heads of state.
The delegation also met with Burkina Faso's new leader, Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. Last week, ECOWAS suspended Burkina Faso from its governing bodies over the January 24th military coup. On Monday, the African Union followed suit. Suspension from all the body's activities until, quote, the effective restoration of constitutional order. In Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou, some, like Mamadi Sanfo, responded that they don't care about the AU.
We condemn the African Union. It is the union of evil. They work for the whites, not for us. They work for their own interests.
The African Union and ECOWAS suspended two other members, Mali and Guinea, over their own military takeovers last year. But while regional leaders and their allies have condemned Burkina Faso's coup, they also find themselves with limited leverage. ECOWAS has stopped short of imposing sanctions, despite concerns of instability in a country already beset by militant violence. Ayokor-Botchre said ECOWAS would work with the new administration to tackle the menace of terrorism.
Well, staying with that story on Burkina Faso, the African Union, as you heard, they're also suspending that country in response to that military coup. Let's try and get your reaction to the story. Director for the Geneva Centre for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, David Otto, joins us tonight. David, good evening, and thanks for your time. When one looks at what is happening in West Africa as a region in general, there seems to be different countries that are facing various elements that contribute to the kind of instability that we're seeing. But regional blocs like ECOWAS and the African Union are also drawing scrutiny because this action doesn't come out of nowhere. So before we have even a military coup, there are signs of instability. Where are they in all of this, and what are they doing in responding to those warning signs?
I think that is one of the main questions that advocates of the African Union and the blocs of the likes of ECOWAS, have been asking. What is the role of the African Union? Why are these organs not proactive? And why are they reacting to military coups? What happened to preventative measures? And I think that's the key question, because as you've said, these military coups are just an indicator of the fact that democracy is under siege. So it's now a very challenging atmosphere in the Sahel, but also in West Africa, where we now see the ballot of the box is being replaced by the barrel of the gun, where the military feels that being the third party, which has been used by very weak political institutions, to keep the peace, has the right to take power by itself. So it's very challenging. But I think one of the biggest, criticisms of the regional blocs, it's the fact that they have established or exposed themselves to double standards. We are talking about not just military coups, but we've seen a lot of West or Sahelian countries, launching what I call constitutional coups, where governments or presidents who have stayed in power will change the constitution to favor them to stay much more longer than was earlier stated. And when people or the population rises against the state, what happens is they then deploy the military. So the military, has been used, as the only tool in the box, of these African states. And now it believes, that, with the guns on its side, it can, overthrow these democracies. So, I mean, that is what is happening. And I think the African Union and ECOWAS, must actually look back into the mirror and see, how much, they can be able to reestablish their importance, in terms of, protecting the unity of the continent, but also the integrity of some of the states.
When we look at, what has happened in Guinea, in Mali and Burkina Faso, of course, there are multiple factors that have led to the coups. But let's talk about whether there are common threads in terms of what the underlying factors are to help us better understand what is happening in that region.
I think what is most important to first of all understand is that, for those who are advocates of democracy, democracy doesn't provide any justification for a coup. So it doesn't say if this happens and that doesn't happen, then you can launch a military coup. It doesn't provide that, nor does it provide a justification for a constitutional coup. But that is happening. Now, the reason why, these countries are experiencing some failed coup d'etats, as we saw in the case of where we've seen in Sudan in 2019, there was a successful coup, but in Ethiopia there was an attempt. We had the same attempt in Niger Republic. We had the same in Central Africa Republic. These are just the ones that failed and the ones that we know. There are so many coup d'etats going on that we don't know. But what causes them? What are the underlying factors? I think there are several. And, there is no unique element within one country, although what we've seen is, for example, a copycat of what, happened in Mali in 2020 being repeated in Burkina Faso, i.e. the Burkina Faso, the Burkinabe government saying that the government could not, preserve the security of the state against jihadist groups of Al-Qaeda and ISIS version. And therefore, it could not, create, that element of social contract. It then used the same template, which was used in the case of Mali to overthrow Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta by the military junta. So there are common threads there. But I think when you look at the underlying factors, is the failure of democracy. People do not feel that, haven't voted for their leaders, and haven't been promised, certain economic, political, and social changes. They have been met. And when that happens, with the military, having that much power in the continent, it therefore sees an opportunity, to, run the country themselves. So we are back to the early 70s when African countries gained independence and, it was much more of a military affair. One would have thought that, some of those, factors or underlying factors, would have disappeared. But we're back to a situation where it is the barrel of the gun that controls, the ballots. No longer it's. I mean, voting. Democracy is no longer, some popular, system of governance. I think it's back to the strongmanism.
Of course, part of what we've seen historically where coups are concerned is that often they're also tied to economic interests, whether of different individuals or parties. In that context, then, how would you analyze what is happening in order to try and really speak to how to bring it to an end and how to bring stability where there are these competing economic interests?
I mean, when people cannot, afford to drink water or buy bread, the cost of petrol goes up, or people can't find jobs, unemployment becomes very high. Coupled with what has been happening globally with the pandemic of COVID, there has been a serious damage to the economy of countries. And perhaps one could link it to the prevalence of coup d'etats as we see it in the case of the Sahel, or in the case of Mali and Burkina Faso and Guinea as well. That economic impact, is there, and that is what most of the military juntas are taking advantage of. You know, they're saying to the people that we're carrying out this coup on the basis of trying to stabilize the economy. But what is very crucial here is that, you know, after carrying out the coup d'etats, we still do not see any improvement. And that is why I think that there is no justification for a coup d'etat. But, you know, my advice to any government that is vulnerable to the economic indicator, which might attract, you know, these coup d'etats, is you address those issues, you know, talk to the population. Now, I think what is happening in the case of Africa is that most leaders do not engage with the population beyond the campaign. After that, it's business as usual. They do not actually fulfill some of the promises that they make during campaigns. And, you know, the military is there to, you know, fill in the gap. So, yes, I agree that economic, you know, downturn can impact on these levels of coup d'etat. But, you know, I don't see, you know, the coup leaders themselves, you know, coming up with a solution. So, I mean, my advice would be, you know, let governments, you know, open their eyes and understand that, you know, the more you use the military to protect you and keep you in power, you know, the likely the military would fancy that position themselves. And
Sure.
That's what's happening.
Thank you so much for your time tonight. Director for Geneva Centre for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, David Otto.